Good morning, all of you. On behalf of Mera Aziz Educational Society and on my behalf, I am Dr. Sheikh Suleiman, General Manager, Edsel India Limited under the Minister of HRD. Today, it is very fortunate to have the renowned personalities as a panelist of this webinar. I would like to request Professor A. Prasanna Kumar Garu to initiate. Before that, I would like to give you a brief credentials about him. Professor Prasanna Kumar Garu is presently the director, the Center for Policy Studies, and also founder director, Center for Policy Studies, Visakhapatnam. It is going to celebrate Silver Jubilee in October 2, 2020. In the last 25 years, the Center for Policy Studies contributed enormous academic articles which are useful to the society at large. And he was my guru, mentor, he was my teacher. In fact, he is my well-wisher also. Because of him, I can say one of the reasons I came to Delhi. And to his few credentials, he was a rector of Andhra University, Visakhapatnam. To his credit, there are so many books and journals, as you know, I cannot read out here. And also, in addition to his erudition and oratory skills and academic contribution, he has a 40 years of experience in giving radio commentary to different sports activities like shuttle, badminton, cricket, especially cricket. And some of the books he wrote are important. He wrote books on the P.V. Narasimha Rao Garu. In fact, I'm really happy to have these kind of renowned personalities on this webinar. And the participants also very fortunate enough to listen his lecture. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation. Now I request my guru, Professor Prasanna Kumar Garu, to initiate. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Suleiman. This is Zarina Suleiman, Commodore Uday Bhaskar Garu, who has been a source of strength to Center for Policy Studies, in particular, Vizag in general. Has always been kind to me. Whenever I invited him to address the center, he never said no. I'm very happy to share this experience with him as one of the panelists. Young JNU political scientist, Dr. Sheetal Sharma ji. Very happy that you are also taking part in this. And esteemed participants in this webinar. I begin by, first of all, bringing to your kind attention a very famous remark made by the father of the nation. When India was about to get independence, Gandhiji said, all of us know that Mahatma Gandhi, when India was celebrating independence on August 15th, 1947, Gandhiji was fasting and praying in a Muslim house in Calcutta, praying for communal harmony. That was what the father of the nation was doing. We were celebrating as youngsters, school boys were busy filling our pockets with toffees and celebrating the Independence Day, August 15th, 1947. Now this webinar being organized exactly a day after India has entered the 74th year of independence. We need to congratulate Dr. Suleiman on the idea. And we must also thank Commodore Uday Bhaskar for finding time to join us in this discussion. We're very happy that a young assistant professor from JNU is also with us to share her views about independence. She was not born when India became free, but I was born, Sheetal Sharmaji, and I can talk to you with greater confidence about what happened then and what you should do in the years to come. Because the past belongs to us, the future belongs to you, and the present is, of course, under the control of Dr. Suleiman and his wife. Therefore, in this situation, I would like to first of all quote the father of the nation, Gandhiji, who very famously said, independence must begin at the bottom. True democracy must be worked from below by the people of every village. That was a very noble and famous exhortation made by the father of the nation when India became free in 1947. Now, I would begin by first of all bringing to your kind attention the fact that universal adult franchise was given. It was a very bold step. It was a revolutionary step. India's march to freedom was unique in the sense no country in the world achieved independence without bloodshed, without violence, without revolution. And for achieving a through non-violent revolution, independence, for the then second largest country in the world, I'm told India is going to be the #1 country as far as population is concerned in a few decades from now. Then India, the largest democracy in the world, gave universal adult franchise. This was a very interesting point and an intriguing point also, in the sense that if you look at history, advanced countries gave adult franchise, universal adult franchise. In fact, it was not universal. It was restricted. All of us know that franchise was not given universally. Women were denied the right to vote till the 20s of the last century, till around this time 100 years ago. And therefore, it was a very bold, revolutionary step that India took, universal adult franchise. And everybody was concerned about what would happen to it. In the Western world, adult franchise was given after the Industrial Revolution. In India, adult franchise was given before India became industrialized. That was a very unique step. Therefore, when universal adult franchise was given, and when the first general election was held, there was a famous quote by a doyen of political science, the late Rajni Kothari, who said it was a revolution of rising expectations for the people. A revolution of rising expectations. When you cast your vote, you feel you are empowered. When you cast your vote, you know you are electing a representative. When you cast your vote, you also feel that you're electing the chief minister or the prime minister of India for that matter. Therefore, this right to vote gave people an opportunity to exercise their power. And therefore, at that time, a revolution of rising expectations. All the people thought that they would get wonderful opportunities of employment. They would get all the benefits that were accruing to people in advanced countries. And all these things were high expectations. That is why Rajni Kothari said, when a revolution of rising expectations is not fulfilled, it turns into a revolution of rising frustration. Rising frustration did not occur immediately, but it began to seep through the pages of history. When you go through how people became disenchanted with the performance of the government, I shall come to that a little later. The second important thing that we must bear in mind, no country in the world has conducted so many elections on such a massive scale as India has done. All credit to the Election Commission. All credit to the government of India. Such a massive scale. The most massive mandate was given in 2019 in India. The world was aghast. Even the Americans today, on the verge of electing a new president in 2020, they are looking at India. How could you accomplish such a wonderful feat of conducting such a huge election so peacefully and so successfully. That is why Rajni Kothari very rightly said, if Indian democracy has been kept alive, it is not by the educated people. It is not by the employed people. It is not by the rich people. It is by the poor people. It is by the disadvantaged people. It is by the people who went and voted, having full faith in the democratic process of India. That is a tribute to the people of India. And Dr. Suleiman, please salute the national flag and also salute the people of India for having kept democracy afloat despite several difficulties. Now, I would like to mention here the fact that India has been attacked 5 times, 4 times from our neighbor, Pakistan, and once from our equally important neighbor, equally difficult neighbor, China. So despite 5 attacks from across the border, India managed to survive as a democracy. No less important is the fact that in 1975, democracy was thrown out of gear when national emergency was imposed by the Prime Minister. And India survived that shock also. For 2 years, there was no democratic governance in India. It was national emergency. So freedom of expression, freedom to criticize, all these freedoms were put in cold storage for 2 years. That also happened. And also, ladies and gentlemen, in this gathering will be interested to know that 2 crises took place in the 60s. We were all teaching at the time. One crisis was the sudden death of Jawaharlal Nehru, the architect of Indian democracy, the man who designed institutions, the man who raised institutions, and a man with very high, lofty ideas about freedom and democracy. And he died suddenly on the 27th of May, 1964. There was a shock. The nation, what would happen? And in fact, there were books, some of you might have heard, interestingly, from the Western world. After Nehru who? After Nehru what? After Nehru how? Their assumption was that Indian democracy would die once Jawaharlal Nehru passed away. It did not happen. Equally important was the fact that in less than 2 years, Lal Bahadur Shastri, who succeeded Jawaharlal Nehru, passed away after the Tashkent Agreement in 1966. So 2 sudden deaths of prime ministers of India, heads of government, put the nation in a state of anxiety. Luckily at the time, leadership in the form of Kamraj Nader, it took charge of the situation and the crisis was managed very ably. And these 2 successions did not cause much difficulty for Indian democracy. And in the process, India contributed a wonderful principle that is accepted by political scientists as a significant contribution to political lexicon. That concept is consensus. Consensus is building agreement among people, different kinds of people. All of you know Jawaharlal Nehru, when India became free, spoke to one of his friends and said, I am very scared of the fact that so much of diversity is there in this country. How can we keep diversity and unity together? Will India remain united? Nehru asked a question in great anxiety. That was quoted by Mr. P.N. Huxer. And Mr. Huxer suggested pluralism and transcendence would solve the problem. Therefore, Jawaharlal Nehru was concerned as much as Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, who greatly unified India. It was a magnificent achievement by Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, uniting, bringing together more than 560 princely states under the national flag and making India one nation. I always say that 4 names deserve to be remembered with gratitude, with adoration. Mahatma Gandhi for bringing freedom the way he did it, unique in the history of the world. Jawaharlal Nehru for building democracy. Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel for bringing the princely states together into mainstream. And Dr. B.R. Ambedkar for heading the Constituent Assembly Drafting Committee. and producing a wonderful constitution that brought millions of people into mainstream politics. These were some of the important achievements. Therefore, with all these things, I come to a very important question now. The prospect part of it, I would like to make a few comments after I hear Commodore Uday and Dr. Sharmaji later. But in the meantime, let me please mention one important point, that India today is still in a state of anxiety because of communal problems, because of caste politics. Somebody asked a question, is politics casteized or is caste politicized? Either way, primordial loyalties have taken over in many cases for wrong reasons. And that is why Indian democracy has sometimes been put on the back foot. And people call Indian democracy an electoral democracy. And a famous writer in India called it election-only democracy, nothing more than that. India is famous for conducting elections, but not for fulfilling the important ideals and aspirations enshrined in the Constitution. Have we ensured for the people equality of opportunity? Have we ensured that exploitation of the disadvantaged sections has come to an end? Have we ensured that women can walk freely at midnight? A very famous ideal quoted from the Mahabharata, that it is a good society where a woman is free to walk alone at midnight. Has it been happening in India? Women are unsafe in India, said a foreign journal recently. The most unsafe country in the world for women is an exaggeration, though, is India, said a foreign journal. Now, coming to the point, I will discuss the prospects later after listening to Commodore Uday and Dr. Sharmaji. But in the meantime, I would say very happily that Indian democracy has stood the test of time, has stood the shocks, has stood the challenges very well, and kept the flag flying. I, on this happy occasion, would like to salute. Who should we congratulate, Suleiman? Who should we salute? We, the people of India. We, the people of India, have given the Constitution to ourselves. So we salute the people of India for keeping democracy afloat. And we are looking forward to the younger generation to do what they should do. I shall come to that after a little while. In the meantime, let me tell you that having witnessed the rise of Indian democracy from 1947 till date, as a boy in 1947, as a person who is living longer than he expected in 2020, I personally feel Indian democracy has stood the test of time, and Indian democracy deserves to be commended by the world for what it has been doing. It was described as a role model democracy in the first 10 years. Maybe a time will come when Indian democracy will once again become a role model democracy for the rest of the world. Thank you, Dr. Suleiman. Now, Uday Bhaskar Garu will take over. I think I leave the entire thing to the chair, Suleiman.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. And we will come back to you again. Now I request Sheetal Sharma. Before Sheetal Sharma speaks, a few words about her credentials. Sheetal Sharma presently, she's an assistant professor, Center for European Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, JNU, New Delhi. And her main specialization is on gender studies, empowerment, higher education, sociology, and international relations. She knows me for a long time, for the last 14 years, because she worked in my organization earlier. She was my colleague. Later, she joined in JNU. Now, she selected for prestigious European Union Visitors Program 2020. This is a very prestigious program, and study visit to Brussels, individual tailored to gain first-hand information to the European Union's values, functioning, activities, policies, and perspectives. To her credit, there are so many awards and rewards, and a few of them, and I would like to mention, in addition to is one book published, and there are so many 47 research articles were there to her credit, and also video lectures published around 82. She was also actively associated with the NCRT for MOOCs, and she guided 17 PhDs and 20 MPhils. Interestingly, and she TV and media appearances about 200, and every week we can see her in Rajya Sabha TV. So that is a few of her contributions. Very happy that Sheetal Sharma, today you are joined with our gurus. Now I request you to speak on our identified topic. Thank you.
Namaskar to all of you, first of all. Super Guru Professor Prasanna, Commodore Uday Bhaskar sir, you have always been a source of inspiration to me. We have met on few occasions in some of the seminars, on couple of TV programs. My guru, Dr. Sheikh Suleiman, from whom I have learned so much in my life that I can't speak in terms of the words, that I have a limitation. And Zarina ma'am, namaskar to you also. And all the panelists, those who are there, some of my colleagues, those who are working in different universities and teaching and carrying on the vocation of education, and the students, if there are in the participants list. My namaskar to all of you, and I'm going to speak on the topic of democracy in retrospect and prospect. I'm basically a sociologist who has ventured into the field of political science and international relations. So my vantage point always remains sociological, and I'm going to analyze democracy as an institution for you a bit historically, then talking about the past, present, and future of democracy. I've been given 15 minutes, so I'll allocate my time in terms of emphasizing on these three domains only. Now, the story of origin of democracy is very interesting. When we talk about Indian civilization, we tend to identify democracy as being discretely there around, but as a formal institution, we tend to teach in political science and understand in sociology that there is a point of time in history in Europe from where we identify the emergence of democracy as a modern institution. And that point of time, that event in history, is called as French Revolution. Now, French Revolution established so-called democracy. But then Europe had a different kind of experience with democracy, in democracy, out of democracy, dictatorship, then monarchy, and there was tumultuous time. But the story and origin of democracy is very interesting, and then how it struggled to survive. And I would say there is never ever a point of time in history since the birth of democracy that we have seen that it hasn't struggled. Now, why do I say that it has been struggling? And it has been struggling tremendously for its survival and for its understanding. Now, particularly, if we look at the point of time in history when after Second World War, large number of nations got their independence, democracy was seen as an ideal to be cherished, but the victory of Russian society led to a challenge to democracy. The challenge was posed by communism. And it is very interesting to note that around 1970s, there were around approximately 130 countries, and out of these 130 countries, 100 countries, I would say 100 countries, almost 2/3 countries were communist countries or socialist countries. They were pretending to be democracies, but they were controlled by dictators and the people, those who had absolute power in their hands. Democracy was seen as something which was an institution, a value which was cherished or practiced by an elite club, primarily concentrated in the Western, Northern European part of the world. And this led to a kind of distinction between the First World and the Second World. India was the only light available for the global community to see that democracy was being practiced in the Third World, but still, despite being democratic, there were two instances. One is that India stepped into India, emergency was imposed in India during mid-1970s. And then the second was that despite being democratic, despite believing in the institutions of democracy, we were inclined towards the Soviet Union or the Russian Federation. Now, the issue is that at that point of time, democracy was really struggling. And Vietnam War was one such event in the history, once again in the modern history, that had seen that democracy was thought to be not surviving at all. In 1956, Nikita Khrushchev made a very important statement. He said, "You believe or not, history is on our side." And the era was seen as triumph of socialism, not of democracy, and socialism having a different form of political and economic organization. But how did democracy survive? It was almost emaciated and thrown in the dustbin. But how did it survive? I would say, in my opinion, and some of the scholars also reflect upon this, is that it was the nuclear weapons that helped for the survival of democracy because of the philosophy of MAD, mutual assured self-destruction. NATO was not as numerically preponderant as the Warsaw Pact, but there was something that was underlying, that if in case there is a war on liberal democracy, on capitalism, by socialism or dictatorship, we assure that nobody comes out alive. And that was the struggle. That was the point of time when democracy was struggling. But suddenly, the fate of democracy, the cosmic, if you believe in astrology, you may have this kind of explanation that the stars for democracy changed during the mid of 1980s. And this also happens from the place from where democracy had faced its toughest challenge, that is Russia, USSR, the erstwhile USSR. At this point of time, what happened that there was a turmoil in the East, there was a turmoil in the Central and Eastern European countries, and there was ultimately a triumph of democracy. The time is too short for me to explain all these things, but then the process of gravitation, the pull towards democratic institution, democratic functioning, that led to the demise of this kind of system, and then there was a triumph of capitalism, but by capitalism, I mean the triumph of liberal democracy, because economic and political institutions were going hand in hand at that point of time. Now what? Now the present. If I plot the journey of this democracy throughout the history, since its birth right from French Revolution, but how it had fared in the last century and 20 years now. Initially, democracy was addressing the political concerns of this society, because if I say economy, society, culture, all these are part of social institutions, or all these parts of society. Democracy initially was answering the political issues or the political quest of the masses. As Prasanna sir said, that it was also concerned with the franchise, that who votes. And number of Western European countries or European countries or all over the world, women had to really struggle in order to say that we are also individuals, we also have a right to vote, my vote also counts. Then after World Wars, and particularly during the Cold War, democracy was responding to two questions. One was the economic question and the other was the political one. The Eastern Bloc was all concerned about the economic aspect of it, because they had to control, they have to design an economy. But the West had an advantage that along with taking care of the political aspects, it was also having a richness in the supermarkets. So they had refrigerators, they had microwave ovens, they had ACs, which the Eastern world was not enjoying at that point of time. And that was the reason that democracy became attractive to these people, that yes, it has something more to offer than just having a right to vote. And now, in the last 20 years, I would say democracy is trying to address from political to economic. Now, democracy is trying to address two important aspects of our social life. One is the social life and the other is the cultural diversity. And while addressing these two questions, and particularly cultural diversity, democracy is facing another challenge. And what is this challenge? First is the challenge of trying to be neutral. That is, democracies are considered to be neutral in the ideal typical sense. When I define the concept of democracy, it's highly bureaucratic, and the ideals of democracy, in the words of Max Weber, it's basically something which is very bureaucratic, very technical and instrumental in nature. By nature, it is not made to address the issue of diversity, but when it is practiced, it stumbles upon the issue of cultural diversity. Yes, In India, it is a successful example of a vibrant democracy, a functional democracy. But in smaller societies and in some of the communities world over, there have been different experiments and experiences of democracy when it tries to address the question of neutrality and being impartial. Now here, the institution of democracy has to be neutral, impartial. But when it is practicing, it acquires a tone or a flavor. And this flavor is of majority. And that is why whenever we understand democracy, whenever democracy is operating, it reflects a kind of majoritarian tone. And this is where they do not remain impartial as they are supposed to be, ideal typically or in theory. So what happens, as a value of democracy, you tend to give people right to practice their religion. And in some countries in Europe, I would say, they deny you construction of minarets. So the problem between the practice and the theory of democracy is something which is going to be a challenge, which is going to be challenged. How do you manage cultural diversity? The second is that democracy itself becomes site for contestation. And contestation, the political contestations, which emerge once again from some of the cultural affiliations. Sir has already introduced the idea of communalism and caste as two important sources of inequality and discrimination or polarization. So these are becoming the sites of cultural contestation. And how do we see? On one hand, we offer people freedom, we offer people equality, we offer people justice. But at the same time, the world which is not governed by any kind of, say, rule book, the social world, where these inequalities, these differences, these discriminatory practices have been happening for a long period of time, these places become site of contestation. But at the same time, there is something good in democracy or something good in the kind of political institution or their configuration, that they also offers you chance to perceive something objectively. But this objectivity is only once again existing in the value orientation. And when it comes to practice, it becomes very difficult. So once again, when we talk of these cultural contestation, it becomes impartial to a certain extent, and Sri Lanka is a very good example. But when we talk of objectivity, then we take example of Belgium, which has given a very good role model of accommodation as something which is a cherished value. Both are proclaiming to be democracies and both are democracies, but the kind of functioning, the kind of features that they have assorted and applied and operationalized in their own context, these are two different models. Sri Lanka on one hand ruled by majority, and Belgium on the other hand by accommodation as a spirit. The third important feature or the third important challenge that the democracy is going to face while dealing with cultural diversity is the principle of equality and justice. What do I mean by this? This is once again an idea of relative disadvantage. It is not about something that we tend to see in all the communal or caste-based discrimination or distinctions. This is something where we see that on any so small or bigger ground, it becomes a polarization between the in-group and the out-group. And what you preach and what you practice. When we go back into history, the Enlightenment, ideals, science, rationality, all these things were preached by the Western world, but their practice in the colonial world was entirely opposite to this. Yes, they gave us a lens to perceive a different kind of social and cultural practice that we were having in India. Say, for example, sati was glorified, sati was seen as honor, but seen from this Western perspective, it was a murder only. The same goes for honor killing in the contemporary times. It helps you to perceive a world. It helps you to critically analyze your own social practices. And that is why this is an advantage in certain contexts and a relative disadvantage in certain contexts. Because if I say that, okay, we are comparing cultures, what authority do we have to compare cultures? That which is a good one? Because the idea of ethnocentrism or the idea of relative superiority of particular cultures cannot be established at this point of time. Either it will happen at the end of the history that, okay, now we see relative outcomes of these cultures, culture A and B, and how do we compare them? So in theory, it gives us an advantage, but in practice, it sometimes brings us back to those distinctions, those differences. Now, the last issue that I talk about is it's a source of critical self-reflection. Now, what do I mean by critical self-reflection? Democracy is a product of modernity, and modernity is based on science, on reason, on experience, and it gives us capacity to criticize. Now we have to find a common ground on which we tend to be critical of our own practices, not just critical of the other, but intra-group self-reflection. And this intra-group self-reflection comes only when people are also understanding the actual form of the idea of justice and equality. It is within the group sometimes that people are not accepting. And for that, we also require a platform on which all the people are placed equally. And this is where Habermas talks about the idea of communicative rationality. That unless people have a common platform on which they stand and share their ideas, it is not possible for a situation to emerge where you see that there is a communicative rationality or equality in communication. So form of expression that we talk about in democracy. Coming to the conclusions here, I would say that democracy as a concept in the contemporary world, as we read in newspapers, understand on TV and debates and all that, the quantitative aspects of democracy are more valorized as compared to the qualitative aspect. And this is where I say that there is a difference in theory and practice, and the difference can be understood in terms of the formal aspects of democracy as compared to the substantive aspects of democracy. And that is why the qualitative outcome of democracy is less as compared to the quantitative. We tend to say we are the oldest, we are the biggest, we are the most vibrant, but we are all focusing upon the institutional aspects of democracy rather than understanding the substantive. Otherwise, if we would have emphasized on the qualitative aspects of democracy, we would have been giving not just 33% reservation, but 50% reservation to women in the parliament, and that would have been actualized by now. The third is that despite justice, equality entrenched in the constitution, at societal level, the practice, the discrimination is continuing, and in some cases, it is becoming more intense, I would say, rather than getting diffused or getting bridged. Once again, another point of my conclusion is that Rousseau and all, they talk about democracy being, expression of general will of masses. But the kind of social structures, and why I time and again go back to social structures, social institutions, because my vantage point is of a sociologist. I study society and social institutions. And the general will as ideal of democracy is not actualized because in practice, the specific will or the particular will prevails. Look at the political parties. If I give you example of some of the features of democracy in which political party happens to be one of the important feature. Even the political parties that tend to contest the democratic elections, they are also not democratic in nature. And you have n number of examples without me telling you which parties am I talking about. And they tend to reflect the specific will rather than the. Now what? In prospect, I would say that democracy, not just as a qualifier, it has to become a noun in the sense which includes both the formal aspect and the substantive aspect of democracy, both the procedural as well as the institutional and structural aspect of democracy. There is need to deepen democracy. There is need to expand democracy. There is need to widen democracy. By deepen, I mean wherever democracy is there, it needs to be intensified. The areas which are not under the ambit of democracy as yet, they have to be widened. And wherever it is happening, you say it has deepened, it has to be intensified. It has to be given greater push and galvanized. Democratic transition, yes, it is happening all over the world. There was triumph of capitalism. I would say it was also triumph of democracy. But how would we ensure that democracy succeeds? Democracy has struggled a lot for a long period of time. I gave you certain events in the history. Now, what is the future of democracy? The prospect. The prospect is that the democracies have to become responsive to and they have to become accountable to whom? Not just everybody, but more so to the youth of the society. Because as time has changed, so have ideals. And not just ideals, so have the aspirations. Not just aspirations, the expectations. And not just the expectations, the deliverables that democracy has to give to the youth of this country. if we boost upon the idea that 65% of these the people of Indian society are less than the age of 35, the yester generation has to identify the expectation, aspiration, and all those things that the young generation is having. You can't run a system. You can't run a system which is based on something which is archaic in nature. All of you use mobile phones. Until you update your software systems, you are not able to have a freely flowing data information coming to you. So even if I take another example from the automobile industry, the basic principle of running a car are similar. You have a steering, you have tires, you have engines, but there is an improvement in engine efficiency also. And if at all you do not change the model, you cannot expect people to buy your product. So we have to respond to the age in which we are living now. And that is why we have to make democracy relevant to the youth. Otherwise, they might get attracted to something else which may not be the future good for democracy. So to end this by saying the difference between substantial and formal form of democracy, I would say there was a point of time in history when Indians were believing in democracy, but they were not belonging to democracy pre-independence era. Post-independence era, they were belonging to democracy, also believing in democracy. The last 50 years, the future is going to be that we have to believe also in democracy and we have to belong also in democracy. But if in case we cannot make it relevant and delivering to the expectation of people, we may just believe in democracy but may not belong to the era of democracy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sheetal Sharma, for your exhaustive views on the topic. Now I request Sri Commodore C. Uday Bhaskar Garu. Sir, before you speak, just a few words about you. And Commodore Uday Bhaskar Garu now is presently the Director, Society for Policy Studies, which is a think tank in New Delhi. And Commodore Uday Bhaskar Garu served in the Indian Navy till 2007 for 37 years. He was associated with the Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis, IDSA, from 1990, served as Deputy Director from 1996 to 2004, and as an officiating Director of IDSA from 2004 to 2005. Later was appointed as a Secretary to the Government of India Task Force on Global Strategic Developments. He retired in 2007, and he regularly writes columns for some of the country's leading English publications such as Indian Express, Reuters, Dainik Jargon, and the Economic Times, and several alike. And I request Commodore Uday Bhaskar Garu to speak on our topic, the Indian democracy, retrospect and prospect. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. First of all, I just want to confirm with you, Dr. Sulaiman, and all the panelists,
Sir.
that my audio and my video are satisfactory. I hope
Absolutely
you can hear
fine,
me.
sir. Absolutely fine.
Thank you. First of all, let me also follow my co-panelists, Professor Prasanna Kumar and Professor Sheetal Sharma, and thank the Mira Aziz Educational Society
Thank you, sir.
for enabling this kind of a discussion. I think it's a very, very valuable contribution. And as Professor Prasanna Kumar has pointed out, the fact that we are doing this one day after August 15th has its own relevance. So I want to congratulate you, Dr. Sheikh, for doing this. And also, as I said, greet both my panelists, esteemed panelists, professors, both Prasanna Kumar Garu and Professor Sheetal Sharma from JNU. I also may take the liberty, if I could, to say that both of them have made excellent presentations and provided, I think, a very, very important foundation for our deliberations this morning. I will try and build on that. But before that, I'm seeing a lot of names on my screen of the various people who are participating. So again, my warm greetings to all of you for being with us, and I hope that we can have a useful discussion once my own remarks are over. In the time that I have, and I will request Dr. Sheikh to give me an alert when I have about 4 or 5 minutes left, because sometimes, as Prasanna Kumar Garu said, once you discuss Indian democracy, it can be a very extended discourse or extended, kind of deliberations. So please stop me whenever my time is up. Let me stick to the format, which is that you have asked us, Dr. Sheikh, to review Indian democracy in retrospect and in prospect. And I think I endorse fully what my other panelists have said, both Professor Kumar and Professor Sharma, that when you look back at the last 73 years, I think there is cause for considerable satisfaction. And I do want to also commend Professor Sharma for the theoretical base that she's provided. It was very gratifying for me, and I must also introduce my own sectarian kind of view here. I'm a security analyst. So many of my remarks about democracy would be related to the way I see this from the filter of security. And I will talk about human security when I come to this aspect. But I want to thank Professor Sharma for introducing some very important theoretical concepts. She made reference to Weber, Max Weber. She also spoke about Rousseau. And in passing, she had also referred to Habermas and this whole issue of communicative rationality. I hope that time will permit me to go back to that when I talk about the prospects for Indian democracy in particular, and this whole question about what is happening to our communication and narrative. But that is when I get to that point. I just wanted to thank her for introducing these in our debate, our discussion today. Now, there are 2-3 issues. I want to spend lesser time on the issue of the past, because as everyone has agreed that we have much to be satisfied about. Yes, our democracy could be better, but I think in terms of the big ticket items, the big boxes, if you look at the Indian experience in a relative context, I think we should also acknowledge that other countries that acquired their freedom around the same time as India, whether it was in the neighborhood or it was in Africa, which had come out of colonialism a little later, not too many countries have had the same kind of resilience in being able to nurture the democratic process. And again, I think Professor Kumar has very, very, I think, eloquently brought out all the details of that. So on that score, I think India was able to withstand the shocks that had been mentioned, particularly the emergency and various other internal challenges to the democratic impulse, the democratic imperative, and there were a number of them. But to the credit of the system, I think we were able to withstand and stay on the democratic course, barring that brief period of the emergency under Mrs. Indira Gandhi. So this having been said, I think I would like to spend more time on the question of the prospects. Where are we going in the next 10, 20 years? We are at India at 73. If we are all in a position to review India at 80, when we are talking about 2027, I hope that our level of satisfaction would improve. It would be better than what we are discussing today. And it is on this score that I have a few concerns, and I want to put them on the table. And I'm presuming that we have some younger people in the participants and that they would be able to also contribute to this. My concern as a security analyst is, and here again, I want to, thank Professor Kumar for this point. He made reference to Mahatma Gandhi and where Mahatma Gandhi spent the night when India attained independence on August 15th, 1947. And this whole correlation between the attainment of democracy, the attainment of freedom with the people, with the citizen. And my extrapolation as a security analyst is that your democracy has to be refereed against the degree to which it has been able to provide appropriate levels of human security to all citizens, irrespective of gender, irrespective of ethnicity, caste, socioeconomic status, whatever be the various levels of disaggregating society. And here, what Mahatma Gandhi was reminding the leaders of free India, Pandit Nehru, Sardar Patel, etc., in a way was also distilling what was there in the Constitution. that all citizens are equal, and it would be a state and society that would enable the creation of equal opportunities. And towards the end, Professor Sharma had made a brief reference to this whole question of reservations and the kind of contested issue it has become. But more than the numbers, it draws attention to the various inequalities that had persisted and prevailed in our system for centuries. Now, I often give this example, when I talk about democracy in different places, a number of people go back to ancient India and say that, oh, we had democracy. We had panchayats. India was a very egalitarian society. Now the buzzword is Ram Rajya. But I keep reminding them that the historical record is that all of this may have been practiced. I'm not a historian. But all I'm aware of is that there was a very graded kind of disaggregation of society along the Varanas, the caste, various other forms of identification. So you remained within certain social strata. And that is how you said that if you were an emperor, if you were a Raja, you had to come from a certain class of society. If you were a teacher, if you were a scholar, you had to come from a different class. This whole thing is something that India has, in a way, inherited as part of socio-cultural practices. I have no problem with that, because if you read Indian history, we also have a concept of Yuga Dharma. Every Yuga has evolved and created its own Dharma, its own righteousness. So it has been practiced to the extent possible. So my point is that in 1947, India gave it acquired freedom. In 1950, it gave unto itself a constitution in which we envisioned an India, a vision of India. A lot of people talk about this as Nehru's India, Nehruvian India, but I keep saying that more than Nehru, and here again we acknowledge Prasanna Kumar Garu's point, that Dr. Ambedkar, and he was the architect of the constitution and this whole text, which in a way envisions India, the normative India. And as we are aware, there were many debates, there were many dissents, there were many kinds of points of view that had to be synthesized. So my concern today as a security analyst is that if we look at the last few years, if we look at the last decade maybe, and where we are now, I am observing empirically that today there are two undercurrents that are animating Indian state and society. One is an increased level of intolerance. In extreme cases, it is being manifest as hatred. And my concern is that you cannot sustain the normative democratic experience on the equivalent of a negative, whether it is a sentiment or an emotion or a deliberate ploy, to keep this kind of an undercurrent alive and to thrive on that, which is the equivalent of very cynical opportunism. Now, what I'm saying is, I'm sure those who are able to read the subtext can make the connections, that there are 2 or 3 events that have happened literally in the last week that I thought, or maybe last 10 days, that I could draw attention to illustrate my point. My first big kind of, shall we say, major observation that I want to place on the table as to why am I concerned about the prospects of Indian democracy over the next, as I said, 7 years, which is India at 80, 2027. It is an anxiety, a fear that citizenship is no longer going to be seen as being equal to all. We will not have uniform citizenship for all Indians, as envisioned in the Constitution, which, as I said, is the Yuga Dharma of India from 1950 onwards. And we are now talking about a certain introduction of the filter of religion or different forms of identifying the citizen. Religion is perhaps the most, shall we say, visible at this point in time. Recently, we had the controversy over the Citizenship Act. Now, it has generated enormous amounts of emotion and passion in the country, which I think is unfortunate. It should have been discussed in Parliament. But we are aware that in the democracy that we talk about today, in the last few years, exacerbated by COVID and pandemic, Parliament does not allow or enable the kind of objective, informed debates that a democracy needs. So this, to my mind, is a shortcoming which is being ignored. So now we have democracy through the practice of democracy or obtaining the pulse of the people, either through social media, which I think is very misleading. And I'll come back to Sheetal's point about communicative rationality and its misuse. Or we are substituting television debates, 8 p.m. to 10 p.m. as the equivalent of the Indian collective expressing its own view or choices, which also I think is very, very unfortunate. So this is the first, I would say, major concern that I'm putting on the table, that citizenship is now being sought to be introduced in a graded manner. And to a large extent, it is also reflecting the politics of the country, which is now a very distinct, visible movement to what you might call as the ideological right. For want of a better word, it is often now talked about or referred to as Hindutva. I don't want to hijack today's discussion into theology and make distinctions between Hinduism and the practice of Hinduism and what is Sanatana Dharma and what is Hindutva, etc. But the reality, I think, was exemplified or distilled in what happened on August 5, where we had Ayodhya. We had the Prime Minister leading the country, and there was a certain narrative that had been built up about centuries of humiliation having been overcome and a resurgent, quote unquote, Hindu India. Now, I think this is very slippery. Furthermore, if time permits, we can debate this, but the Prime Minister actually introduced an equivalence between August 5th, Ayodhya, 2020, and August 15th, 1947. Meaning that what was the culmination of the Supreme Court judgment was being now equated with the freedom struggle. That is very problematic because I think the freedom struggle had a certain trajectory, it had a certain context, and it has to be, I think, viewed in its entirety. To suggest that August 5 and the Ayodhya temple and the laying of the first brick, the silver brick, is now the beginning of a resurgent India, which will now lead to whatever be the aspirations that have been identified, is, I think, going against the grain and the spirit of what had been envisioned, as I said, in 1950 in the Constitution. And this, to my mind, I think is cause for concern amongst those citizens who are able to examine and review this in an objective manner. The second, more recent development, which again, I'm sure everybody is aware of, it causes me great concern as a citizen, is the Supreme Court decision recently in relation to the Prashant Bhushan case. Now, if you read the judgment and the way in which the court had approved it, to me as a citizen, the concern is that dissent or any form of criticism is not being tolerated by the highest court in the country. This is where I come back to this point about a culture of intolerance. And my question and anguish as a citizen is, does it augur well for democracy when the whole predication, the whole basis of democracy is dissent, debate, and again, going back to Prasanna Kumar Garu's point about the ability to forge a consensus. In Hindi, we talk about Vaad Vivad, which brings you to Samvad. The discourse has to be distilled from Vaad Vivad, agree, disagree, have a debate, deliberations, which is what we hoped would happen in Parliament. It did, by the way. If you see the debates of the 50s and the 60s, or even I would say you go back recently to the time when we had Prime Minister Narasimha Rao and Prime Minister Vajpayee, the quality of debates in Parliament was of a high order. Unfortunately, we don't have that. And why I'm concerned about the Supreme Court judgment is that there is the majesty of the law. No one disputes that. The law and its interpretation is central to democracy. But if we are increasingly going to move towards, as I said, an ecosystem where the most prioritized and the most, I would say, in a way, sought after determinants are intolerance and hatred. I submit that the prospects for Indian democracy are looking bleak. It will become more contested. It will become more, alas, violent. And that goes against the spirit of overall societal security. And this is not new. History has reminded us, if you go back into history, this correlation between religion, politics, and societal stability. Those of you who are familiar, and we have Sheetal with us, if you recall the 30-year war in Europe, 30 years, wars were being fought on religion. Other parts of the world would have similar, I would say, examples. And my anxiety, and I've just been trying to get my head around this and formulate my thoughts, why I am more and more concerned about this equivalence between August 5 and August 15. In one case, 2020, in the other case, 1947, is that are we inadvertently reopening issues that we thought we had resolved, not satisfactorily, but to a certain extent, in August 1947, when India opted for a path, which was against what is now in history described as the two-nation theory, where Pakistan had chosen, for whatever reasons, I don't want to open a debate on Pakistan, Pakistan chose to identify itself on the basis of religion. We know what has happened to Pakistan internally. A good example of the price you pay, for those who are familiar, is the plight of the Ahmadiyya, a sect in Pakistan. Or for that matter, the plight of the Shia, which is another variation of the Muslim identity. An objective historian will tell you that a very heavy price has been paid in prioritizing one strand of religious identity, etc., etc. My greater anxiety is that in 2020, are we reopening an issue or a debate that we thought had been, as I said, reasonably closed, and that India's citizens are all equal and would not be graded according to any other form of identity? So it would have been, I think, very, very, for me as a security analyst, enabling if this issue of Indianness had been resolved in a consensual manner. Unfortunately, my observation is that more than consensus, we are moving towards very, very prickly and emotive contestation. And in this, I'll close on this point, Dr. Sheikh, I'm sorry I've taken more time, is what Sheetal had said about cognitive rationality. I think to me, one of the more, I would say, disturbing aspects is the way in which narrative is now being utilized in a very cynical, opportunistic way in the pursuit of power. Now, this again is not new in political theory and sociology. If you read Foucault, what does Foucault say? That the ultimate purpose of power is to shape discourse. Today, our cognitive rationality is being seduced. It is becoming cognitive either irrationality or it is becoming cynical opportunism. And I think the best illustration of that is fake news, which we in India are dealing with. Other societies, other states also have their own exemplars of fake news. But this is the last point. If you want to see the power of discourse and narrative and how it can be used to stoke passion and emotion leading to bloodshed in a mass scale, just remember what happened in Rwanda. The Rwanda massacres took place based on radio, which was a new technology at that time. So I am concerned as a security analyst that the prospects of Indian democracy and India at 80, if the current orientation and the current trajectory is allowed to be strengthened, that it may not be as promising, but I remain an optimist. I remain a cautious optimist about the resilience of Indian democracy to deal with this challenge also. Maybe if there are any doubts, it's about myself. That as I'm getting older, I wonder if I'm becoming more abject about the ability of the system. And I only hope that I'm proved wrong. And if some of us are able to review this at some point, India at 75 or India at 80, I hope the younger people can pick up some of these issues and, basically remind me that I was wrong about my current pessimistic outlook about the near future. Let me stop here. Thank you, Dr. Sheikh, and thank you all of you for giving me this time to share my thoughts.
Dr. Suleiman, can I have a word, Dr. Suleiman? Are you able to hear me? Are you able to hear me, Suleiman? Dr. Suleiman?
Yeah, it's clearly audible.
We can hear you. Please go ahead.
Are you able to hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Suleiman?
Yes, sir.
Yeah,
It's clear. Yeah.
I cannot agree more with Commodore Uday Bhaskar's absolutely relevant, very firm statement about the happenings during the last few months that cause anxiety. He's a security specialist. I don't want to be a specialist on anxiety, but then I am also deeply concerned about the happenings. Now, just 2 points I would like to take, Dr. Suleiman,
Yes, sir.
which are reserved for the prospect.
Yeah.
One is on corruption, the other is on communal harmony. These two things I shall make a brief reference. Sorry. Thank you. About 20 years ago, I told you the Chief Vigilance Commissioner, Mr. Whittle, came to Vizag and addressed the Center for Policy Studies. He spoke on corruption. He mentioned very brilliantly 5 important aspects of corruption. It is just like a hand. The hand has 5 fingers, and every finger is as important as every other finger. What are the 5 fingers of this hand of corruption? Number 1, the Neta, the leader. Number 2, the Babu, the bureaucrat. Number 3, the Dada, the criminal. Number 4, the Lala, the businessman. Number 5, the Jhola, the NGO. These 5 fingers are really the essence of corruption. That is a hand. Can we fight it? I don't think, as Mrs. Indira Gandhi herself conceded, corruption leads to violence, violence leads to poverty, poverty, violence, and corruption. There is a causal relationship between the 3, said Mrs. Gandhi. I agree with her. Therefore, the younger generation especially should think about the possibility. You cannot totally eliminate corruption. You cannot eradicate it, but you must fight it. These 5 important forces. The next important thing, communal harmony, to which Commodore Bhaskar Garu has made a very important reference, the happenings in the recent past. Let me tell you, in 1924, Mahatma Gandhi wrote a letter to Jawaharlal Nehru, and he was deeply concerned. Communal discord is not new. It is more than 100 years old. And in a letter to Jawaharlal Nehru, Mahatma Gandhi said, Nehru, I want you to start flying squads. He called them flying columns. Squads of people who rush to the scene, prevent a communal clash, or at least solve the problem, if it is possible. Therefore, we need to think of it very seriously. Now that you are organizing this webinar, especially for the benefit of the younger generation, involving young teachers also in this, it is time India started in every village, every town, every city, these flying squads. These flying squads, by that I mean eminent people, including those from professions like teaching, medicine, law, politics, administration, and certainly those representing the minorities, the disadvantaged sections, and in particular the gender. A women's representative must be there. If you float this idea, it's not going to be a reality tomorrow or day after. But every young person in the country must seriously reflect on this, especially those who are studying in universities and colleges and teaching in universities and colleges, of organizing this kind of a body, flying column, as Mahatma Gandhi said in 1924. They are flying squads. What do? They are troubleshooters. They go and sort out the problem. And after all, bringing people together. That is why building bridges is a very easy thing, is possible. Not the bridges we generally talk about, bridges of understanding. A spark neglected burns the house, said Tolstoy. And that's exactly what is happening in our country today. Therefore, your organization, Dr. Suleiman, must also have, leave us out. Me, Commodore Uday Bhaskar and others, the elderly people, please leave us out. Have a particular webinar, I'm suggesting, making bold to suggest to you, have a webinar to start flying squads of young people, of distinguished people, young and old together, forming flying squads to prevent communal clashes in every village, every town, and every city. It is time India has done it. Otherwise, 74 years of independence is absolutely without meaning. Thank you for the opportunity given.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Now we have one or two questions. A question from Professor V. Ramesh. His question is, how do we take India to next level to be recognized as role model for the other nations of the world? Sir, Sukumar sir?
Just as we took in 1947, just as we had taken India,
Okay.
Just as we had made, we, in the sense of our forebears, our elders had made 1947 to 57. Why was India considered a role model democracy? Why has India declined? These questions must be answered. A sociologist is there in this panel. She should be able to explain why India has suddenly declined. You don't put the burden. That is why, as Dr. Kalam used to say, the family and the school should come together. The parents, the teachers, and the students must come together. You cannot have, politics is a very important subject. Politics is not a bad subject. And Suleiman, you and I suffer from a disadvantage. When you and I say we studied politics in Andhra University,
yes, sir.
People would mistake us for having practiced politics in Andhra University. We have not done it. Now, studying politics is something different. Politics, the main function is making the impossible possible. Can we make the impossible possible in India? We can do it. Mr. Ramesh's question is a good question, but I think people like him must design, must try to evolve some kind of procedure, mechanism by which India gets back to the status it had enjoyed in the first 10 years. Thank you.
Sheetal, would you like to respond on that?
Yes,
Yeah, sure.
after Uday sir, he was also raising his hand.
Sheetal, please you go ahead. I will follow you.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's quite likely that I'll have very little to say once you finish.
Okay. I would say, that the modern institutions, somewhere we tend to exist in binaries in the sense that either we dislike the colonial system or we appreciate it a lot. We have to understand that when as a sociologist or as a social scientist, we tend to understand the world, we have to choose the elements and have a balance between the way we tend to take a stand. Now, why am I saying this? And why India could not cash upon its either demographic dividend or its ancient civilizations, rich history and all these things? The problem is that we are not using the instrument properly for which it is meant. What do I mean by this? Say, for example, we are using our refrigerator as an almirah. Refrigerator has a different function to perform, but we are using it for a different thing. Or we are using a hairdryer as a fan. Now, why I use this metaphor here, that what things are meant for, we are not using them for it. Let me take you back to history. When French Revolution happened and people challenged monarchy, they had a very, history full of blood and violence, and then they established democracy. And once they established it, they did away with all the cultural affiliations, and then they said we have buried it forever, and now we are going to be modern, secular. And what they meant by it. Now let me give you another instance, and I would request all the panelists to imagine as I say. In Europe, during monarchy, there was a relationship between the king and the subject. And the king, I would request you, all of you, to imagine as soon as I say, imagine an image of a king. And an image of a king emerges in your mind, it flashes in your mind depending upon your cultural and historical and societal orientation. Everybody envisions an image of a king. When I say a subject, an image comes to your mind, an image flashes in your mind, and you can identify a king and a subject. Now, there was a quest to replace this relationship of king and subject with state and citizen. Now, if I ask you to imagine image of a state, nothing comes to your mind. And if I say citizen, nothing comes to your mind as quickly as you can imagine king and a subject. And that's the beauty of objectivity. Once they said that we are going to do away with all cultural and religious, communal, historical affiliations, they could successfully do it, which means they use refrigerator for freezing only. But what we are doing is that we are using a hairdryer for a fan. What we are doing, we are trying to pull, we're trying to apply the rational, secular, objective, scientific ideas and institutions on a society which is, they are full of these divisions, they're full of these differences. Now, there is nothing wrong with these differences. There is nothing wrong with this diversity. But the issue is that the kind of dish that we are going to make out of the ingredients, there is a mismatch. And this is where we have not been able to board the bus that we intended to do. Our destination is something else. Our means of reaching that goal is something else. And that is why whenever we try to imply, that's why I emphasize so much on difference between theory and practice, that we are preaching something else and we are doing something else. On the name of Vikas, we are trying to go after something else. And that is where is the problem, and we are not able to combine, set the correspondence between our goal and the means to achieve this goal. Thank you very much.
Okay, Sheetal. Sir, Uday Bhaskar garu,
I just want to make a brief.
Yeah, straight away.
Can I?
Yeah, straight away there is a question for you. I think you can include that.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, is Dr. Samuel Dayakar from Andhra Loyola College, Vijayawada. He wrote a question directly to you. Sir, as you said, the Parliament of India has no time to discuss and come to conclusions on important domestic and international issues. Whose fault is this? Ruling party, opposition party, or civil society?
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Sheikh. I'll just first add to the points made by Prasanna Kumar Garu and Sheetal about the earlier point about what should we do. I'm in a very happy position that if you follow two professors, in this case Prasanna Kumar and Sheetal, they are like Vamana. So in their few remarks, they cover all the ground and all the area. So I don't have to say very much. But let me add to what they have said. I fully agree with their points. But to the specific point asked by Mr. Ramesh, I think, about what should we do? What is the wish list? Let me repeat what I've said something in the past. A democracy is a dynamic entity. So as we go along, we have to refine, we have to review, we have to apply correctives, improvements, whatever. And I think one central feature is to be able to restore where required or enhance, as the case may be, institutional integrity. You know, we are familiar that democracy and translated into governance is based on various pillars of both state and society. In a very theoretical kind of model of democracy, we talk about the executive, we talk about the judiciary, we talk about the legislature, and the role that is being played by the media/civil society from the outside as different pillars of the edifice of democracy. My anxiety is that in the last decade, particularly, there has been a lowering of the bar in terms of institutional efficacy and integrity, contributed to by a combination of ineptitude and turpitude. When I say turpitude, Professor Kumar has already spoken about corruption and the way in which Mr. Vithal had, I think, very graphically explained that. But across the board, and this relates to the second question from Vijayawada of Mr. Solomon, the reason why our parliament today has become almost dysfunctional, and I've been writing about this year after year, saying that our parliament does not discuss national security. And today we are having this discussion when we have a serious challenge on the line of actual control with China. But it appears that India's collective attention is elsewhere. It's either on the cricketer Dhoni, or it is on a film star who's no more with us, or what is happening in the domestic politics of Rajasthan. You know, I'm just saying that as a society, it appears that our priorities are being deflected onto other issues. So you must come back or acknowledge that our institutional integrity and competence has come below the median. And nowhere is this more evident than in the case of education. Now, I imagine that many people who are part of this discussion today have some correlation with education. Professor Kumar is a very eminent emeritus professor of Andhra University. Professor Sharma is at JNU. Many of you are, I'm sure, in colleges, universities, etc. And I think India's greatest, I would say, handicap now is that to the extent that India's young demography is the future, and Nelson Mandela made a very famous statement once that if you want to improve national security, invest in education. Today, we are diluting that aspect of national security. And education is prioritizing ideology over competence. And I'm sure everyone on this panel knows what I'm talking about. I see this in the few instances that I'm aware of, where even appointments are being determined more by ideology than by basic core competence in a given discipline or subject. So if this is how you are going to identify and select your teachers, what will happen to your students? And I come back to this point that to me, the outcome of all of this, you know, what in Hindi we call the natija, will be on national security. And therefore, I think restoring institutional integrity is my plea. And this relates to the question about whose fault is it if Parliament is not discussing it. I would say it's a collective failure. We elect leaders who are abdicating, and as civil society, as voters, we are not able to change the pattern. When, to extend Prasanna Kumar's point, today we are witnessing the politicization of crime and the criminalization of politics. And all this is recorded, by the way. But yet we seem to be allowing this to happen. So there is a collective failure, which we must, I think, acknowledge. Only if you acknowledge, you can apply a corrective. I hope that answer is satisfactory to the person.
Thank you, sir. I think there are two questions before we sign off. One is Professor P. Prakash. Earlier he was the additional secretary in UGC, of course retired. His query is religious and social structures. We are not able to have a presidential form of government so as to enable the democracy becomes more relevant to the present democratic dividend, particularly in the context of growing knowledge society. Sir,
I'll answer this.
Yeah, please, sir.
This is a very interesting and important question, because Dr. Ambedkar and Nehru agreed on one point,
Sir.
that India should have a parliamentary type of government, not a presidential type of government.
Yeah.
Because a parliamentary type of government, they felt, perhaps they're right, I don't want to pass judgment on it. A parliamentary type of government is more accountable. Accountability is more transparent than a presidential type of government. I don't want to give the example of Donald Trump today, what is happening in America, how they are envying India, the parliamentary democracy. The envy is relative, of course. But then the point is, we opted for parliamentary type of democracy for two reasons. We have had experience in the parliamentary type of governance, 1935 Act, etc., etc., 1919. And at state level, governments were formed by Indians. Before freedom came, there were state governments headed by Indian political parties. And therefore, we had experience with parliamentary system of government. And Ambedkar and Nehru, on this point, they agreed and they strongly pleaded for a parliamentary type of government in preference to a presidential type of government. That is the answer I wish to give to our friend Professor Prakash, isn't it? Thank you.
Thank you, sir. And I think this might be the last question from K. Sri Lakshmamma. Please comment on hereditary democracy, which is prevalent in India. Uday Bhaskar, sir?
No, let Sheetal answer this. I'll come back after the last one.
Okay, Sheetal.
Okay, it's hereditary democracy sounds to be very interesting concept. If in case I take you back to the origin of civilization, a kind of need for sharing, a kind of need into the process of decision making was always there. Once again, I bring you to the basic notion of democracy. What does this mean? It talks about equality, it talks about representation, it talks about involvement of people. That we, in the modern democracies, we never talk about involvement. But in smaller units, if you can imagine hunting and gathering societies, where to stay, what to kill, how to kill, what not to kill, these were the issues where you talk about the involvement of people. Now, once again, in the beginning, we were talking about, Prasanna Kumar sir was saying behind every successful man, there is a woman, and unsuccessful man, there are two women. And as you can see, this process of participation, this process of involvement, this process of representation, it starts from the very basic building block of society, which is called as a family. Now, I don't know how to apply this to heredity, but this is the basic requirement of every social community or social institution, where whenever the power or the decision making get concentrated in the hands of either one individual or only couple of the individual, it becomes a problem. Now, in my conclusion, I had said that it has to be made relevant to the youth. Now, it is once again not a binary situation that the older yester generation has to be written off, because their experience is so valuable. You just cannot wade the murky waters without their experience and holding their hand. At the same time, we just can't rely on their shoulders for a long period of time, because the new generation has got different sets of instrument to also lead the country. They did not know about the touch screens and all these things, where my younger son, 5-year-old son, is so well versed with this. So once again, I'm very optimistic, like both my senior panelists, that there has to be a combination and balance of these things. It is there inherent in our DNA, but how do we take it out? How do we operationalize it is something which has to be very meticulously designed and determined, so that we can have best of the results.
Okay,
I
thank
just
you.
want to add, Dr. Sheikh, can I just add?
Yeah. Sure, sir. Go ahead.
2 points, if I may. One is in relation to the hereditary aspect in democracy. I have been trying to observe this in a very empirical way. And to the extent that each country has its own experience of democracy, my observation is that it is a very, very interesting pattern to study. That there is a clear, I would say, preference towards hereditary patterns in democratic governments and different countries. I'll give you an example. The United States is often cited as the oldest democracy. Now, we are aware that in recent years that we are familiar with, we had the history of the Kennedy brothers, where there was one family that was differently represented in government. Most recently, we have what is called as the Bush family, where you had the senior Bush as a president, then you had the junior Bush as the president, then you had a brother of the Bush family, standing for the elections, and so on. So there is a distinctive pattern that each country has, and I think it needs to be a more detailed way. Japan, Abe himself, as you are aware, had a grandfather who was a prime minister. Canada recently has got a son who has followed the father's footsteps. We in India are aware that whether you talk about the Congress party and this whole question of dynasty, from Pandit Nehru to where we are now, or regional parties. Look at different parts of India where regional parties have become relatively strong, even in UP, whether it was Mulayam Singh and his son, Bihar, so on and so forth. So I think there is an empirical pattern that needs a certain amount of study. But at the end of the day, and I go along with Sheetal's point, which is I think we have to see what is the most optimum outcome, so that the purpose of the democratic experience is maintained or resolved. But maybe this is a subject for another discussion later. A last point, which is related to the earlier point about India and the center and the state, that the federal election that Professor Prasanna Kumar had touched upon. I think this is a very important aspect of the Indian experience. I would be a little cautious before moving towards the presidential form or endorsing that for a variety of reasons. Time doesn't permit me. But it's very easy for distortions to creep in either form, presidential or parliamentary. Today, we are seeing a situation where, because of various developments, including the bifurcation of Andhra and Telangana, that UP has got a locus now in Indian politics, which to my mind is disproportionate. UP may have 200 million people as population, but if you see this in terms of what is happening in Indian parliament, as everyone says, the road to parliamentary power is make sure you win UP by hook or by crook. And I think the crook part is becoming more predominant. And in Indian politics today, we are seeing the cowbell, and I don't use this phrase in any derogatory way, more as a description. The predominance of the Gangetic, UP, Bihar, Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan, largely Hindi speaking, in terms of how they are able to carry greater weight in the center is something that needs, I think, study. And its most recent manifestation is the new education policy, where it appears that by choosing the so-called three language, you are prioritizing Hindi. And the current, I would say, protest from Tamil Nadu is illustrative of this. And this again reels back or loops back to my point that are we introducing divisiveness in the next 5-10 years as a feature of Indian politics and democracy? And is this something that we as citizens need to be thinking about? But let me stop here again, Suleiman. Thank you very much for giving us this time. Very interesting.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Okay.
And can I propose vote of thanks now? Any comments from your side?
Not necessary. Not
Okay.
necessary. Your thanks are always there.
Yeah. I
Thank you for this.
Yeah, I take this opportunity to salute my guru, my teacher, my mentor, Professor A. Prasanna Kumar Garu, and Commodore Uday Bhaskar Garu for sparing your valuable time in this webinar. And also Sheetal Sharma, I express my gratitude. She was my colleague, and I think she also participated today. Thank you, madam. And I thank some of the universities, like Adhika, some of the universities requested their students to participate in this webinar. Some of them I mentioned here: Adhika Nannaya University, Rajahmundry, and Andhra University, Visakhapatnam, Sri Y.N. College in Narsapur, and Sambram Group of Institutions, Bangalore, Reva Group of Institutions, Bangalore, and Geetam Institute, Hyderabad, because there are some social science students, and Galgotia University, that is in Noida. So there are some other universities also, very few. And I request all the young people, young people to submit your articles based on this webinar. The time is up to 18th evening 5 p.m. You can send the mails already in the registration link. I have given the details. As you are aware that for the first prize we are giving 3,000, second prize 2,000, 1,000 for third prize. And with academicians, we identify the best articles with the supervision of the academicians. We finalize, we will announce. And also we will put in our website also, and my channel is there. DR means Dr. DR Sheikh Suleiman. So if you visit that channel, and you can find the earlier webinars also organized by Uday Bhaskar sir and Prasanna Kumar sir on PV Narasimha Rao on constitutional values, and this one on democracy. And in future also we are going to organize very useful webinars especially for the younger generation. At least this is our contribution from our side. What I believe is, suppose if I look back and I need to see that there is a satisfaction. If I look forward, I need to see that there is a confidence. This is my belief. And with this, I thank once again my panelists, very excellent orators, and scholars for giving a valuable lecture and opinions to the younger generation. So I sign off with this. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Thank you, one and all.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.